The views expressed on this programme are not necessarily those of the presenters or Soundart Radio. It's our aim to give a platform to those who've stepped out of their box in search of answers to the existential questions asked by many of us. Who are we and why are we here? If the views and experiences of others' exploration into consciousness and our true nature interest you, then stay tuned.
Welcome to Follow the River on Soundart Radio, online at soundartradio.org.uk and 102.5 FM locally. Your hosts tonight are Sue Minns and me, Gerry Granshaw. Our studio guest tonight is world-famous healer and best-selling author. As a young man, he underwent many scientific studies into his psychic abilities, and then a chance request changed his life and demonstrated that he could heal. Working as he does with the inexplicable, he sought to know life and consciousness beyond the manifest universe and has experienced deep insights. I'm very excited to welcome Matthew Manning. Hi Matthew,
Hi,
it's
Gerry.
lovely to meet you. Starting on a high note, you had what I would call a transcendent experience in your 20s when you were in the Himalayas. Could you tell us about what happened and how it shaped your life?
Let me just take you back into the sort of couple of years prior to that, where I'd written a book, which some people may have read, called The Link, which was published in 1974. At the time I was 19 years old, and it had the most enormous success. It sold over 1 million copies and was possibly one of the worst things that happened to me in my life, because nothing prepares you as a guy of 19, first of all, for selling a book that sells 1 million copies, and secondly, for dealing with the world's press, who at that time I think were a lot more aggressive and a lot more sceptical than they are now. So I'd spent 2 or 3 years promoting the book all over the world and felt very much that I'd become little more than a performing monkey wherever I went. And wherever I was being interviewed, somebody wanted me to do something. And there was one specific thing which I always remember. I was giving a press conference in Germany, and the German press were very, very aggressive and very hostile, and I always had to demonstrate it, otherwise we don't believe you. So the press had found this lovely elderly gentleman called Professor Schiebler from Ravensburg University, and I think he must have had some sort of interest in psychic phenomena anyway, and he was more sympathetic to me. And he'd built a gadget, and to this day I don't know what it was, but it had a box which I assume had some kind of electrical circuitry in it, and a loop of wire coming from the box from one side to the other. And on the loop of wire were 10 light bulbs. Now his idea was that if I really concentrated on this piece of, on this gadget, and put all my sort of what he calls psychic energy into it, I should be able to light up the bulbs. Well, you imagine if you're sort of 19, 20 years old and you're doing that and you're surrounded by hostile journalists.
Gosh.
There were television cameras, there were lights. It was really difficult and hard. And I had, I've got 15 minutes to produce something, because otherwise I know I'm going to get really run down in the press the next day.
Yeah.
So here I am really concentrating on this box, trying to make these lights come on. And I could feel the journalists getting more and more sceptical as the minutes ticked by. And eventually, I think it must have been after about 10 minutes, I just sort of threw my hands towards it, imagining this energy going into the box, and one of the lamps lit up.
Wow.
You'll never guess what the headline was, though, the following day across the newspapers. Psychic can only light one lamp, because it was only one lamp that went on instead of the whole 10.
That's quite typical.
And I was already very, very disillusioned with where I'd been for the previous 2 years, and I thought to myself, what actually am I doing? There's got to be something more useful I could do with whatever gift or talent or energy I've got. Do I really want to spend the rest of my life going around the world, a bit like a performing monkey, doing tricks for the media? There's got to be something that's more useful. And I was at that age where I suppose I'd come in on the tail end of the hippie movement. In those days I had really long hair and a big beard, like guys do nowadays. And I was aware that many people, I suppose starting with the Beatles, had gone out to India looking for enlightenment, looking for a guru or a swami who was going to give them direction in life. So I decided to turn my back on the whole thing, which didn't go down very well with my publishers or the fellow that was managing me or anything else, But I thought it's now time for me to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
So I went out to India, and I spent 6 weeks there, zigzagging across the country. And I can tell you that India in 1977, which is when I first went there, was a very different place to what it is now. And I was in search of the guru who I was sure was going to be found seated cross-legged on the ground, who was going to give me the answers to life and tell me what I should be doing. I never found that person at all, and in my more cynical moments, because I do have a cynical side as well, I thought maybe all the gurus from India were now in the West in nicely air-conditioned chalets. But then in the last week that I was there, I had always, from the time I was a child, and I don't know why, had this tremendous fascination, attraction, almost a pull to the Himalayas. So I was in Delhi and I rented a taxi. You could do that kind of thing. And I told the taxi driver I wanted to go right up into the Himalayas. So we set off and we went through the foothills and went through a town called Simla and rose higher and higher up into the Himalayas until eventually, late one afternoon, the car broke down. As I discovered later, the reason it had broken down was because we'd gone so high up, there wasn't enough oxygen to keep the engine going. So I thought, well, we can't go back down the mountain now in the dark. It was scary enough going up in the light. So I stayed in this village called Narkanda that night. It was the coldest night I've ever had in my life. I now know that I was about 12,000 feet up. But the mountains in front of us were absolutely vast. I'd never seen anything like it. They were rising up maybe 25,000 feet. And at the time I had a very expensive Olympus camera. And I thought what I'd like to do is to get up very early next morning before the sun rises and put my camera on a tripod to photograph the mountain, the sun rather, as it comes up from behind the Himalayas. So I got up in the dark, set my camera up, and I never took a photograph. And to this day, I don't really know what happened, but as I sat there, I had the most extraordinary experience, and I was, 21 years old? Something which I really, for a long time, couldn't really verbalise at all. But it was as if, and it was a timeless zone, and I don't honestly know whether it lasted 10 seconds or 10 minutes, but it was as if suddenly I was completely at one with everything, and everything else was a part of me. It was as if I was a part of the rocks. The mountains were a part of me. I felt completely at one with the trees and the vegetation around. Everything became completely still and one. And I felt something all around me. And I'm not a religious person, but this was what, in a way, started me on a path that maybe was spiritual rather than religious. I felt something all around me, which I will say was probably the closest thing to God that I've ever experienced in my life. And whatever that was, urged me to do two things. First of all, to do only those things which I wanted to do, regardless of what other people wanted me to do for their own reasons or motives or finance or profit or whatever. And secondly, and this was a bit more strange for me, to follow only those paths which would lead to healing. And I have to say, I knew very, very little about healing at that point. I was familiar, well not familiar, I was aware of the work of the late great Harry Edwards, who I always believe was the greatest healer that this country ever produced, and he has always been sort of my idol. So when I came back from India, I realised that in fact I'd found the answer that I'd gone there looking for. And ironically, being a young guy who was a bit bullish, had any cross-legged Swami sitting on the ground told me exactly the same thing, I would never have listened. I had to find that answer for myself, within myself. So that was really the experience that changed my direction and pushed me into healing.
That's absolutely fascinating. Because we're talking to, last week, we're talking to David Icke, and he had what I call a lightning bolt like that, which just allows you to believe in. I think he refers also to Ibn Alexander. If you have something like that, it convinces you of other levels, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And over the last 40 years, I've talked and written about that experience so many times. And I've always been struck by the number of people who have come back and said, I've had virtually the same or a very similar experience, and it had the same effect on me. It's turned someone's life round, as you just mentioned, almost like that lightning bolt. And it doesn't have to be up in the mountains. It can be in your garden, it can be on a beach. I mean, mine just happened to be in the mountains, which in a way makes me feel a bit better as well, because I did wonder at one point, because I got a slightly scientific inclination to my brain, whether it was an experience caused more by lack of oxygen, and which some detractors may have said.
Yeah.
But then now, having met so many hundreds of people who have had the same
Yeah.
or very similar experience, I know it wasn't.
Yeah.
Because you can be anywhere and you can have exactly the same experience occur to you.
But would you get that sense of love or sort of, that spiritual connection if it was to do with lack of oxygen? You'd probably be
Good
closer
point.
to passing out.
No, I had never thought of that, and I think you're probably right. I don't think I would have done. But that was really what led me towards healing, because prior to that I'd been doing quite a lot of research work with scientists, predominantly in Europe and in Canada. And there was one experiment that I will just touch on, because this was in early 1974, just before the link came out. I'd been working in Toronto with a group of scientists, including Britain's Nobel Prize winner in physics, Professor Brian Josephson, who, as some of your listeners may know, is very much into transcendental meditation. He'd actually won a Nobel Prize at the age of 32 for work that he'd done as a student, I think when he was about 16, and he got, it's called the Josephson effect, that's what he got his Nobel Prize for. That came to him in a similar blinding flash as I'd had in the Himalayas. So anyway, these researchers were very interested to find out what, if anything, was occurring in my brain whilst I was engaged in what they called paranormal activity, which might have been trying to influence a piece of electrical equipment or whatever. What they found, I always thought was fascinating, because as I was doing these things, my brainwaves began changing, and they saw a very specific brainwave pattern which they'd never seen in anybody previously, or had never been reported to anybody previously, and they dubbed it a ramp function, R-A-M-P, because it looked like a ramp. And you have to bear in mind that 40 years ago, seeing inside the brain was not the same as it is now. But one of the things they did was to try and locate what part of my brain was producing this particular brainwave pattern. They then discovered, after several days of working on it, that this strange brainwave pattern, which nobody had ever seen previously, was coming from a part of the brain which we all possess. It's the oldest, most central, most primitive part of the brain, wow, which they believe, or it was believed then, we've all got, but which is dormant, inactive, or not used by the vast majority of the population. And from that point on, I always felt that whatever I'm doing, and I know many other people do similar things, it's nothing to do with little green men from outer space. It's not something that's going forward. It's actually a throwback. And I believe it goes back to a time when, in the absence of technology and the life we now live, we were forced much more to use our feelings, our instinct, our intuition to find food, water, shelter, direction, maybe even to heal. So from that point, I've always felt that what I've got is not something that's specifically unique to me or individual. I think we've all potentially got it, and I think it's a throwback.
Because you were talking then about, you mentioned intuition, and that was going to be one of my questions. I'm really interested in intuition, and it seems that people are respecting it more highly than they used to. So what are your thoughts about that intuition, where it's coming from, whether it can be developed?
I'm sure it can be developed. And I think find me somebody that's never had an intuitive experience, or that flash that tells them something, or a flash that's warning them something. And it comes back to what I was just saying. I think it's that primitive part of the brain that suddenly fires off and you get this flash of intuition. So I think it is something that we've all got. And I don't know why it's now more widely accepted. I think maybe because people aren't so concerned anymore about discussing things in public. And I know, again, I mean, so many people have had really quite extraordinary experiences. They'll pour it out to me because they know I'm a safe audience. And I think they're frightened of telling anybody else because they're going to get ridiculed, yeah, or mocked or whatever. But it's made me realise over these decades how common these experiences are. And I think we're maybe just living in a society that's slightly more open to these things and not quite so dismissive.
It doesn't bear any resemblance to Robert Munro's experience, the Gateway experience, does it?
I don't know a great deal about Robert Munro's work, other than I think it was his out-of-body work, wasn't it?
The two hemispheres came in
Yes.
synchrony, and then that created a gateway out of which his consciousness went.
That's an area that's always fascinated me, because the brain, as we know, has two sides, the right side, the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere. And it does seem that different parts of the brain are controlling different functions. So although this is what I'm going to say is a generalization, it's not specifically correct, but generally the right side of the brain is the side which controls or influences creativity, art, and almost certainly intuition. The left side of the brain is the side which is much more rational, analytical, logical, and I've always believed the answer is, as you've just sort of said with Robert Munro, to get both sides working together. Most people are what are called left hemispheric dominant, which is why they're right-handed. The left side of the brain is controlling the right side of the body, and as a society, and there are probably very good reasons for it, we do tend to be logical and rational and not pay so much attention to the other side, which may be intuitive, feeling, sensitive.
Do you think then that we're going back to more right brain people, because the whole, into the scientific and everything's mechanical and it's that kind of loop right down, but we seem to have turned some kind of corner in that respect, so that dreams and visions are more frequent than they used to be. Say 20
I don't know
years
whether
ago.
it is that, though, or whether it's just that it's much easier to communicate information about these things and ideas about these things, and so therefore people say, well, I've had that as well. And if you go back 80 years, you wouldn't probably have found it written about in newspapers or magazines, but now we've got social media, we've got the internet, everything suddenly has been blown open and has been changed, and people are communicating their experiences in a way that they've never been able to do before.
So how does that tie in with your healing? Are you using intuition, or is this just a flow of energy through you?
Oh, the answer to that, Gerry, is I've always felt whatever I'm doing, the energy is not coming from me, the energy is flowing through me. I avoid that word channel because it's a bit airy-fairy, and I try and keep my feet a bit more on the ground, but I've always felt that it is an energy which is flowing through me rather than from me. And after I got back from India, I got involved in what amounted to almost 5 years, not continual, but certainly on and off over long periods of time, 5 years of research in laboratories, working with scientists and medical researchers, where it was my job to influence, for example, enzymes in test tubes, blood cells, cancer cells, the growth rate of seeds, and so on. And I've always said that if you can produce that effect in a test tube, you can't say that that's the result of faith, placebo, psychological factors, or anything else. And then one experiment, which I'll tell you about because I can do this one quickly and it's easy to explain, but this is one of the experiments that I took part in America. If you take human blood and you place it straight into water, the water causes the red corpuscles, the red blood cells, to start being stressed, and they start expanding. As an analogy, it's rather like overinflating a balloon. So after a while, they go pop. As they go pop, it makes the water go cloudy because they're releasing the hemoglobin from inside the cell into the water. However, if you buffer that water slightly with slight saline solution, it protects those blood cells for slightly longer. So during one of the experiments that I took part in, they were taking human blood from different people, putting it into a solution of a saline solution in a test tube, and it was then my job for 5 minutes to give healing to that solution in a test tube. There was another test tube also containing blood cells in a different part of the room or a different part of the building that had no interaction with me whatsoever. We did that experiment not just once, but I think it was about 100 times. So you can't say it was just a one-off.
Yeah.
We found that those blood cells that I was influencing in the test tube stayed intact without bursting open for up to 20 minutes.
Wow.
However, those cells which were left in the same solution in a different part of the building had all disintegrated within 5 minutes.
Wow.
So that was obviously a healing effect that you can measure very, very accurately. With other experiments, we put the samples, and it wasn't necessarily blood cells, it might have been some of the work I did was with cancer cells. We put them in a Faraday cage, which shuts out all electricity, magnetism, electromagnetism, radio waves, but they were still being influenced by me outside the Faraday cage. So we know it's not any of those energies that we're familiar with. And people have always said, well, what do I think that healing energy is? And I know it sounds cliched and it's a bit hippie, but that's who I am. But I think ultimately, as healers, we are, I'm going to use that word channeling again, but directing some form of universal unconditional love, whether it's into a person who needs healing, or whether it's my situation all those years ago, into a test tube containing enzymes, blood cells, or whatever. And I've always rather enjoyed this with scientists, because science will say, well, we can only accept those things which we can measure and quantify, and we can really only accept those things which we can measure and quantify repeatedly in different environments. Well, let me tell you something. There's one thing that you'll never quantify or measure. It's immeasurable, and yet nobody denies its existence. And that is love.
I was just going to say that.
Because there is no gadget, there's no piece of scientific equipment that you can put right in front of you, Gerry, or in front of you, Sue, and say, wow, this person's completely in love. Look, the needle's going off the end of the scale. They're 90% in love. Or put it near somebody else who maybe their husband has just walked out and the dial goes the other way and, well, there's only 5% love left there. You can't measure love scientifically, yet science has never said that love doesn't exist. So that is where I come at it from, that I think all of us are just focusing this universal unconditional love. And I think with love, you can do almost anything.
So do you feel that love as you work? You're a conduit for, does it come from the heart, or does it come?
I feel it coming through me, but I do feel its effect. And I know that sometimes I found myself sitting when I'm working with somebody with a big smile on my face. And I'm sure that if there's anybody else in the room with us, they must think, this guy's a bit strange. He's treating my husband who's seriously ill. Why is he sitting there with a big smile on his face? But actually that's often what that experience does to me. It does put a smile on my face. So that's the closest I can get to putting my finger on what it is.
And how about now? I mean, has the energy changed, or has your ability to sort of channel it, has it changed between now and when you were younger?
Oh gosh, yes. At my age now, it's all I've done virtually all of my life. I've been doing healing for 40 years, and I had 10 years before that of doing other things that weren't specifically healing. And it's a bit like playing a musical instrument or any skill, or being a painter or an artist. The more you do, the more experienced you get, and I hope and I believe the better you get at it and the more refined you get at it. So I know that often now I get better results with my patients than I would have done maybe 35 years ago. Yeah. And I think it is just experience, and it's what I do. It's for me, it's just now like throwing a switch. I don't even particularly think of it.
How do you teach this? I mean, how can you teach it if it's something that actually arrived unbidden in you, didn't it?
Because, Sue, I believe it's something which we have all got the potential to develop and to do. And I've done workshops now for 40 years, and I know that there are many people now who are practicing as healers who started from one of my workshops or one of my courses just from what they've learnt. And I've spent all my life trying to demystify healing. I used to joke that I wouldn't recognise a chakra if I saw one in the street. So I was trying to make my work very down to earth. I think a lot of young mothers will have had an experience with healing without realising it. Maybe they're out with their child, and the child isn't that old, but the child trips up the curb and grazes its knee, and it starts crying. And you know very well what that mother does. She kneels down beside the child, puts her hands on its knee, and counts to 10. And at the count of 10, the pain has magically gone away. And I believe that mother is actually carrying out an act of healing in some way. And I think there are many ways in which healing comes into people's lives in a way that maybe they don't see that it's the same or similar to what I'm doing. I was talking not long ago to a wonderful farmer up on Dartmoor born and bred, and I thought to start with he'd be one of the last people who would accept the sort of things that I do, because he's very much into his animals and calls a spade, but he told me an extraordinary story of how he'd got these warts on his hands. He'd gone to the doctor, he was given medication for it, it didn't work. And then he met, through someone else, a lady who said, "Oh, I can get rid of those for you," what we used to call a wart charmer. He said, "I didn't believe it at all," but she held her hands over mine. And he said, "I suddenly realised a week later they'd gone."
That's fantastic.
And, so that was just a story from Dartmoor. But I hear stories similar to that so frequently. Yeah. And I believe that lady, I mean, in days past, they were often called wart charmers, which is what this farmer called her. I don't know whether she would have liked to have been called a wart charmer. She was probably a very good healer. But, there are many people doing these things.
So that's so interesting. And I don't think she would have liked to have been called that. I certainly wouldn't. So if you were going to give advice to maybe somebody who's quite a bit younger, just learning about this sort of thing, about healing, and they feel drawn to healing, where would you suggest that they start?
2 places. First of all, I think it's extremely helpful to start with an ability to be able to still yourself, to be able to centre yourself, and to be able to cut out external distractions. And in the last 20 years or so, but more specifically in the last 5 years, the whole mindfulness meditation movement has really exploded and become integrated into many areas of our lives. My granddaughter, who's starting primary school next year, when my daughter went, found that they were running mindfulness courses every single afternoon for these little children, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. If you can teach kids of 4 and 5 to meditate and to be mindful just for 15 minutes of the day, where are those children going to be when they're adults? More recently, even in October, it's now got into the Houses of Parliament. And listeners might not know this, but there are now over 160 MPs who are meditating together on a regular basis using mindfulness meditation.
That's fantastic.
And a lot of them have said it's made a huge difference now to how they're dealing with one another, even if they're not from the same political party, that suddenly you see things from a different perspective. So to answer your question, for any young person coming to me, I always say start with mindfulness meditation, because I think a lot then springs out of that. There are also numerous courses for people who want to learn to develop their healing ability. The one that I always recommend, and maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm a patron of the organisation, is what was formerly the National Federation of Spiritual Healers. It's now called the Healing Trust. And they run excellent courses all over the country, which run for several years. So it's no good going for one weekend and thinking you're going to get a certificate. It really is a deep learning experience. You're not allowed to practice until you've gone through a period of being a probationer healer. You've then got to have provided letters or affidavits from, I think, 6 people who have been benefited by your intervention. Then you have got a certificate. So for me, if somebody's serious about learning to develop as a healer, I always think go to the Healing Trust. But unfortunately and sadly, we live in a celebrity-driven society where everybody wants instant results. Gone are the days when people learnt a skill or a craft over many decades. And I remember as a young guy, I used to do healing demonstrations in the weirdest places, but it gave me confidence. Believe it or not, I actually was, on some occasions, working in nightclubs in America. So I've always said, well, if you can do healing and you can do it in a nightclub, you can do it anywhere. I remember in this country, when I was starting out, my first workshops were occasionally held in the back rooms of pubs. And, you learn over a long period of time, but unfortunately now everybody wants to get instant qualification, instant gratification, and there are a lot of courses available for healing where you can go for one weekend and you're on level 1, and each time you go it costs you a bit more until you've got up to level 8 or whatever it is. And I don't really think that that is particularly helpful in learning in depth about healing. There's huge responsibility in healing. It's not just something which you do for whatever reason. It's you've got to be utterly committed to it and be completely there for patients, not with ego.
Yeah, absolutely.
What would you say about the incidence of cancer getting out of control, it would appear to? Do you have a...
So it's not so much that it's getting out of control. There are two things I'd say first immediately. Number one, we are much better now medically at diagnosing it than we used to be. So I think it appears that it's more prevalent than it was. But there's another much more relevant reason for this, for cancer appearing to be more widespread. It is actually a disease predominantly of older and elderly people. And as we are living in society to greater and greater ages, the incidence of cancer is therefore going up. So contrary to what a lot of people think, it's not due to the fact that we're now living in a more stressed society. I do happen to believe a lot of it is probably down to diet, environmental, but actually on a scientific medical basis, the reason the figures have gone up is because we've got a much greater elderly population than we've ever had before, and they are the most vulnerable to cancer.
Oh, that's very interesting.
You've spoken very highly of oncologists that you know and friends of yours in the medical profession. So, and you say that you have quite a scientific approach. So, can you just tell us a little bit about that? Because that's quite unusual.
Well, I've always believed that healing is not a replacement for medical treatment, and I don't think any complementary therapy is a replacement for medical treatment. I'm aghast at some of the things that I see online, excuse me, and the claims that people make. And I've also come upon, over the years, other therapists, including healers, who have said to somebody, well, I can only treat you if you give up medical treatment, which is just so dangerous and so foolhardy. I've also had people who want an appointment with me who have said, I've just been diagnosed with breast cancer. I've been offered surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy. I've decided not to do that. I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to use crystals. I'm going to meditate and come for healing. And I have to say that if there was any good evidence that using crystals, changing your diet and doing deep breathing got women through breast cancer, there would be millions of lives saved every year, and millions of women globally would not be going through the treatment that's there at the moment. It's the best we've got. It's pretty gruesome. But I honestly believe that within 15 years, we'll look back and think it was akin to bloodletting in the 17th century. But for many women and for many people with cancer, it does work. So I've always been one very much who works alongside medicine. And what I'll always say to my patients is, I'm very pro-medical. I've got many friends who are doctors, and I've got many more who are oncologists. But I've now worked on my side of the fence for 40 years. And one thing I know is that they are wrong. The oncologists are wrong with their predictions much more often than they're correct. I think it's partly because they are heavily insured, and I think they always have to give somebody the worst possibility rather than the best one because they're frightened of being sued or finding themselves in court. So I think with healing and with medicine, there is actually an overlap of working with somebody not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually as well. And I was very fortunate because in the mid-1980s, I think it was, I met then a rising star, although I didn't know it, a wonderful gentleman called Professor Carol Sikora, who became one of the youngest professors of oncology ever. And he and I just hit it off, and he had me on more than one occasion go and talk about healing to his medical students.
Wow.
In London. And we've maintained a friendship ever since. And he's now introduced me to his students who have become professors and to other doctors. And we've now got a wonderful network going. And I will say, they do send me patients. They're not going to admit to it, I'm sure. But also I send them a lot of patients. And, you know, you can be at a hospital and, for example, you might have been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. A local hospital, and I'm not disparaging them, will do the very best they can. It's their gold star treatment. But often you need a very specific unit that deals with pancreatic, or hepatobiliary as it's called, cancer. Most people don't know that. So a lot of the people that I work with who come to me and they get better, they say, oh, I went and saw Matthew Manning. But actually, if I'm perfectly honest, it wasn't just what I did. It was actually guiding them to the right consultant, to the right surgeon, which is why I think, we do need to work together. So that I've always, I guess, had the respect of these wonderful consultants and doctors, because I'm not telling people to turn down medical treatment. I'm working alongside them. And I actually do find it horrifying, the number of people who are turning down medical treatment. It seems, and I might be wrong, but I believe because they're more frightened of the treatment than they are of the disease.
Yeah,
and some of them, sadly, I know, have lost their lives in the process.
Yeah. But, to put the other side of it, you could also lose your life even if you've had treatment.
You can, and I know, obviously, it does happen. But, medical treatment is the best there is, but I think all therapies should be working together, not saying, well, I do bark flower remedies, so therefore, only come to me, don't do anything else. I know that, for example, almost all of my patients with cancer book their appointments with me a day or 2 days, if they can, before they're having chemotherapy, because even if I don't do much else, and consultants are aware of this as well, whatever I've done seems to alleviate or stop the worst side effects of the medical treatment.
That's
so if you
incredible.
can get somebody through chemotherapy without the usual horrendous side effects, that's been a huge healing achievement as well.
Absolutely.
So, I'm not out there saying, oh, it's miracle working, and sometimes extraordinary things do happen, but I'm in for the long run with people through the course of their treatment, and getting them through it is about quality of life in the end.
Yeah.
And I'm also aware, doing the work I do, not everybody is going to survive it, and there are many reasons. We could talk for hours about that.
Yeah.
But I do feel that my role as a healer is equally sometimes to help somebody to die as it is to help somebody to live.
Yes.
And if somebody dies free of pain, free of fear, free of anxiety, then I believe that healing has also been successful.
Yes.
The one point at which I would pick up with the medical profession, or not the medical profession, but with some of the skeptics who would say, well, that didn't work because the person died. But you can't measure healing simply in terms of whether somebody survived. It's about the quality of life and the quality of death as well sometimes.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, isn't it? That's really wonderful.
And that's a very interesting topic in itself, death, isn't it? Because we've kind of, as a society, we sort of have shunned it, hidden it away somewhere, whereas it will be just lovely to be able to be much more open about dying, about the process, and, making bigger choices as well.
I think it's something that the vast majority of people are really frightened of. And I think many of them are frightened of it because they're faithless, or they don't have any particularly strong spiritual belief. And I think the people who have got a spiritual awareness are less frightened of death. I should take you back as well, because I'm often asked how I got into healing, because my introduction was actually, as I said, through a laboratory, through working with test tubes and plastic flasks and petri dish and so on. But I would probably never have become a healer were it not for the fact that I sort of got pushed into it inadvertently. It was about 1978, a year or so after I'd been doing my first work in a laboratory, and I'd been doing some fascinating work influencing human cancer cells in plastic containers, at which I was successful. And that had received quite a lot of publicity, and it was also reported in a scientific journal. Anyway, one day there was a knock at my front door, and I, without thinking, went and answered the door, and there was a youngish guy standing there who apologised profusely for intruding on my privacy, but he explained that he himself was a doctor. He was an Italian doctor, and his mother was extremely ill. She'd got cancer, and she was in Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. She'd been taken there because they hoped that they'd be able to carry out a liver transplant. That's where it was first done by the late great Professor Sir Roy Khan. And anyway, having got his mother to the Addenbrooke's Hospital, they said, she's so ill and the cancer's spread, we can't do anything. So this young doctor is now on my doorstep pleading with me to go to the hospital to treat his mother. And I have to say, at that point, I actually wanted to shut the door and say, no, I don't do that kind of work. I only work with scientists. But I couldn't. So I found myself an hour and a half later in Addenbrooke's Hospital, and it was the first time I'd ever worked with anybody. And I didn't really know what to expect. Because I was so young, I'd never seen anybody that was so ill. This poor lady was completely emaciated. She'd got terrible pain. She was vomiting almost continuously. And because her liver was failing, she was jaundiced and had turned yellow. And what really affected me the most, because I'd never seen it before, because of the extent of her jaundice, the whites of her eyes had turned yellow as well. And I just didn't know what to do. So I took a chair and I sat myself down next to her bed and I merely took her hand. And I tried to get back into the same state that I'd been in a laboratory, imagining white light flowing through me into her. And I tried to imagine this white light infiltrating her body, and I tried to imagine her being well, being whole, being free of pain. Anyhow, after about 15 or 20 minutes, I realised that the flow had stopped. I was so naive, I actually believed that she was going to leap out of bed and say, "That's fantastic, I'm cured, let's go now." And when I finished, she's still lying there in exactly the same situation. She's moaning and she's nauseous and so on. And for some reason which I'll never understand, I then, and this was completely from me, I offered to go back to the hospital later that evening to treat her again. I got back, it must have been 5 or 6 hours later, and I was thrilled with what I saw. This lady was no longer in bed, she was now in an armchair in a corner of the room. Her temperature dropped right back down to normal. Her pain had completely gone.
Wow.
Her feeling of nausea and sickness had left her, and she'd asked for something to eat. So she'd been brought dinner. She ate her dinner. So this really now boosted my ego. I thought, yes, it works on people and quickly in the same way that it's been working in a laboratory in plastic Petri dishes. I gave her a second healing session and then arranged with her son to go back the following lunchtime to treat her a third time. I never got back the third time. He phoned me the next morning early to say that his mother had died in the night. And it was such a long time before I ever worked with any person again, because for me that was a complete and utter failure. I thought, well, it works in a test tube, but it doesn't work with people. And it really just took away all my confidence. It took me a lot longer to realise that that first experience had taught me the two most important things I probably know about healing. Number one, healing and ego do not go together. And you have to really just work beyond ego and beyond any great labels or anything else, which I hope I've managed to maintain ever since. And secondly, and this took me a lot longer to appreciate, in fact, the healing had worked. It had worked in the only and the best way that it could for that lady at that late stage in her life when she was dying anyway. It had helped her to die free of pain, free of fear, and in a reasonable state, even if it was temporary. So I learnt from that very first time that whatever I do, it's not about miracle working. Healing works in many different curious ways with different people.
Yeah, gosh, that is lovely, isn't it? We're almost out of time, sadly, but that's because that's brought up other questions for me. So just sort of briefly, if you can cover this topic briefly, so what do you think happens when we die?
I can only give you my personal belief, and you made a disclaimer at the beginning of the programme. I was glad to hear that. I personally believe that we are all spiritual beings. This body is merely a vehicle. I believe that we have a purpose in life, whether we're aware of it or not, and I believe our purpose is to evolve and to grow spiritually. We go through experiences in life from which we can grow and evolve and move onwards and move upwards. And I think that's sometimes why somebody maybe doesn't live that long, because they've already learnt what they came here for, and they don't need to be here for a full 80 years. Maybe in 50 years they've got spiritually where they were hoping to be. But that, for me, is the purpose of life, that we're all a bit like migratory birds, because I also believe in reincarnation. I believe very much that we come back in groupings, and it might not be the same relationship that we've had with people this lifetime. So your mother next time may be your brother. Your lover next time may be your mother. But I think we are all migratory souls, and we're all evolving and moving upwards and higher.
Yeah, gosh, that's interesting. So just, sorry, final question from me. Sorry about that. If anybody would now like to know about what you're doing, if they want to contact you or come to one of your healing sessions or anything that you do, how can they do that? And what would you like to say about that?
There are two ways that you can find out more about me or contact. I've got a website that's very comprehensive that's been rebuilt this year, which is full of interesting case histories. It's got lots of information about the scientific research I did with photographs. It's got everything on there. That's www.matthewmanning.net. I've also got a Facebook site, which is Matthew Manning UK Healer, and the UK Healer in brackets afterwards is crucial because, as I discovered when I went on there are 60 Matthew Mannings worldwide, so I had to differentiate myself from the other 59. But I've got a Facebook site that I work with a lot on a daily basis, putting up posts about healing, about mind-body research, medical research that impinges on emotions and mind-body and so on. Matthew Manning UK Healer, and that excites me because with that I know that I'm reaching a completely new audience of predominantly younger people. What started out as really a service to some of my patients initially, being able to disseminate information to them, I've now got 30,000 followers, which isn't large compared to some of the American Facebook pages, but it's pretty extraordinary from a British healer. But and I do a lot of interaction with people on my Facebook page, and I love that. People ask questions and I can come back to them straight away. Yeah. So there's quite a lot of interaction on social media, but I'm only on Facebook. My daughter keeps saying we should do Twitter. No, I struggle enough keeping up with Facebook. I'm not doing anything else.
I'm absolutely stunned by everything, really. I mean, what a wonderful talk you've given us.
Oh, thank you.
No, seriously, I had no idea the depth of all that you did and how, you've expanded as everything. And it really feels like it's coming straight from your heart, and isn't it wonderful?
Yeah,
it's really beautiful.
That's where healing should come from.
Yes, of course, exactly. Yes, exactly. Do you ever work with your friend Tim Wheater?
Tim Wheater?
Yes.
I do indeed, and in fact last night I got lots of photographs of he and I working together because in October we filmed together in Surrey a healing circle where I work with a group of people rather than individually, and so many people have said to me, what do you do on a healing circle, or what's involved? And I thought, I've described it enough, I need to make a video. So Tim and I have actually made a video which we're condensing down to 12 minutes, which will shortly be on my website and on my Facebook page.
Excellent.
Where Tim was playing the music live and I was doing the healing, and that really is magical.
That would be magical.
Wow.
Sound as well, as we're discovering
Yes.
that working with other people, collaborating with other people really does work.
So that will be available to see hopefully early in the new year.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
So yes, I'd like to say again, honestly, thank you so much for the most interesting, comprehensive explanation of everything. I just take my hat off to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've done it for 40 years. It's
Well, I know. As I said to you, I first heard of you through your book and your 16th century manifestation. I was so taken by that. I think I've kind of kept an eye on you, but to find you down here in our region is really wonderful.
Yeah, living in semi-retirement, or that's what I thought.
Are you?
So I only do healing 2 days a week. The rest of the time I seem to spend doing Facebook and things like that now. But it's still reaching people.
Exactly, but it's going out in that way, yes. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank
Matthew.
you.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
And Sue's going to read us a poem.
I'm going to read it. Actually, not is a poem, and I think we've probably heard it before, but it seemed apposite for today and now. So I think its origin was from a Native American elder. So you'll recognize it when I read it. You've been telling people that it's the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell people that this is the hour, and there are things to be considered. It's time to speak your truth. Create your community. Be good to each other, and do not look outside yourself for the leader. There's a river flowing now very fast. It's so great and swift that there are those who'll be afraid. They'll try to hold on to the shore. They'll feel they're being torn apart and they'll suffer greatly. Know the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above the water. See who's in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment that we do, our spiritual growth and journey comes to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and your vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. We are the ones we've been waiting for.